All righty. Folks, welcome. Welcome to our second installment in the series March on Milwaukee, a digital history series. Today's conversation, race migration and the roots of resistance in the Cream City, helps to further contextualize the open housing marches by taking taking a second for us to go back and think about how we as a city got to the 1960s. I'm Robert Smith, associate professor over in the history department at Marquette University. I direct our Center for Urban Research, Teaching and Outreach, and the gentleman who works with me on this kind of stuff, Adam Carr. Adam, can you introduce yourself really quickly?
Yeah, I do a bunch of different things around Milwaukee, and one of the honors of my life was to be involved in the 50th anniversary of the open housing marches. And as many questions as we were able to answer through that, I found myself with far more questions in the end. And that's why I'm glad we have this esteemed panel today to ask, I think, one of the core questions that I think the open housing marches poses to our city.
Sure. Man, welcome. You know, we've got three historians of Milwaukee, Wisconsin with us. And as Adam and I often say, history is fun. History is a good time. And we've got three folks who are going to give us quite a bit of their own knowledge and expertise, and then we're going to have a good time as well. Let me start by introducing Joe Walser. Joe Walser recently completed a dissertation, Making an Old World Milwaukee, that looks at the history and heritage of German communities here in the city. Joe, welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Glad you're with us today. And then, of course, we've got Reggie Jackson. Reggie Jackson is a busy man these days. He's writing a lot. He's researching a lot. He's worked over at America's Black Holocaust Museum. He's now doing some journalism, and he also has a business, Nurturing Diversity. Reggie, we call on you a lot. Thank you for your time. How you doing today?
I'm great. Good to be part of this esteemed group. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Absolutely. Welcome. And there's one gentleman, when we talk about Milwaukee history, his name is synonymous with that. We could go on and on about the various work and writings and historical research and commentary that John Gerda has provided us, none more important than The Making of Milwaukee, the seminal work. John Gerda, thank you for joining us today. And can you tell us really quickly, where are you again?
I'm in Upper Michigan, not too far from Mount Noggin, sheltering in place, and we're far enough away from people we don't wash our hands.
Well, we thank you for joining us today, and let us know if there's any technology issues on your end. Folks, we are going to do three things today, and the first of which is very much related to what we have been doing around some pedagogy and curricular stuff. We're going to chunk our conversation in three distinct sections. First of which, we're going to do a bit of a historical photograph exercise for about 15 minutes, in which we'll show some images from the open housing marches and some images that our panelists have shared with us. And we're going to use these images as a way to talk about some of the key historical developments that got us to the 1950s and 60s. We'll talk about some of the key immigrant and migrant groups and how they got here, how the city gets sorted along racial lines, and then also just making sure to take a moment to talk about how photos and photographs more broadly help us teach Milwaukee history and our city's cultural histories. The second thing we're going to do is give these researchers a chance to talk about their craft. So the next 15 minutes or so, we'll ask them to talk a little bit about how they go about the task and the art of researching and writing about Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We'll get a bit into their creative process, and then also wrap up with some conversations about teaching Milwaukee history. And then the last 15 minutes, we'll give folks plenty of time to ask some questions of our panelists and get us thinking about some of the key takeaways around Milwaukee history that we ought to be mindful of, and then also tips and ideas about delivering this history in the various media that are available. Particularly in this moment, it's important for us to think about all the avenues and opportunities that learning can continue to occur. All righty, folks, we're getting started with the first section, which will be this process by which we use photographs to explore and uncover history. Adam, why don't you take us into this process? This is your world. You're muted, big guy.
There we go. Give me 1 second here. So Rob and I, in presenting this, which we've done numerous times, we mentioned this last week, but it bears repeating. We learned how important it is to get this into a dynamic conversation that invites people into the space with us. How important media is. We actually found out in Vel Phillips Juvenile Detention Center. We put some of these images in front of the young men, and they started seeing things in these images that we hadn't seen yet, and introducing new parts of the story to us. So I just wanted to share this kind of opening salvo of photos of the open housing marches for our panelists to take a look at and respond to a little bit. We're talking about kind of the period of time in Milwaukee that led up to the open housing marches. You can see here just that sign, open housing, and the big crowd that's congregated around that topic. It was this incredible flashpoint, open housing in the city of Milwaukee. These are some of the images that we've shown and that demonstrate just how dramatic, how full of conflict, how full of just sort of emotion that entire period of time was in Milwaukee. Here we see a confrontation between the youth council and police. Here are counter protesters here for a moment commingling, but then also standing here and sending a very loud and clear message to the youth council, to the commandos, to Vel Phillips and Father Grappi, what people thought of them on the South Side. I actually think in some ways it's important to look at this image without flinching, because it can be difficult to look at, knowing that in the same way that the marchers are still alive, so are the counter protesters. Some more dramatic images of just what it looked like and what it felt like. And I want to close with actually this image here, which is a little bit smaller, but just the general idea. And this is sort of the last piece I want to share before turning it to the panelists. The Youth Council in the years prior to, and actually in the year subsequent to the open housing marches, took on a number of different campaigns. So they'd worked on school desegregation, they'd protested the Eagles Club and employment discrimination, other campaigns. But it wasn't until they found open housing that they ignited the counter protests of the magnitude that they saw on the near south side of Milwaukee. As many as 13,000 angry white counter protesters came out to meet them. And I think in a lot of ways because in the mind of those counter protesters, it must have been because there was some transgression there, or it was literally a sense of trespassing on the part of these young Black marchers. So these images, I can scroll back through them, but I just wanted to share them for our panelists and for our audience, just to see. I actually think the color pictures always make them feel a little bit less in the past than the black and white ones, but just to see a little bit of, just how much was swirling around Milwaukee at this point in time, and talk a little bit about what was happening on the near south side of Milwaukee and on the north side of Milwaukee that sort of set the stage for this clash. And that is kind of my open prompt to you all. And now we can just talk.
For me, some of those images are nostalgic. I wasn't part of the open housing marches away at school for most of those, but was part of the marches with Father Grappi on Judge Cannon's home out in Wauwatosa. We're trying to lift the Eagles whites only membership policy. But after I graduated from college, I came down to the South Side and worked for 3 years at a place called Journey House on 16th in Washington, now Cesar Chavez in Washington. And a lot of those kids were the ones who'd been on the streets throwing bricks at the marchers as they came down. So it was really, there was a lot of sort of dissonance, kind of what was going on, because we loved those kids, got along with those kids, but they were doing some things that were pretty hateful, just two years earlier, and unapologetically. As time went on, the neighborhood became more and more Latino and African American as well, so that became kind of a moot point. But it was obviously it was a really volatile and in some ways anarchic time in Milwaukee's history.
think it's thinking back to the image of the folks walking around with swastikas. I mean, that's really remarkable imagery to think about, particularly on the near South Side where there were so many Poles, that was happening, only 20, 25 years after the Second World War, right? And it was so clearly still fresh in the minds of folks in that neighborhood that folks with presumably with Polish heritage to have adopted the swastika as a sign of racial belonging in the city is a truly remarkable thing to behold.
We'll never know, but my guess is that most of those people were not of Polish heritage. No,
Okay.
the people who were there on 16th Street when I was there were largely people from rural Wisconsin. They were people
Okay.
who kind of come in for factory jobs. So they could have been anything, Germans, Polish, Scandinavian, Irish, Yankee. But it was very much, it wasn't Appalachian, but it was sort of Milwaukee's version of Appalachian. It was people coming from the countryside to work in urban factories, and that was the real flashpoint. There was Crazy Jim's Auto Lot.
Adam talks a lot about Crazy Jims.
It was and that was a block north of Journey House. Jim Grove, he was a case, but he was kind of a magnet, for a lot of the racist opposition to those marches, and that was so there was it. I don't think it had any identifiable ethnic component. It was largely working class white, more generically, and rural especially.
Is it somewhat surprising then that by the 1960s that this broader category of white had begun to play a role in the city, so remarkably connected to distinct European cultural threads?
Actually, that's something too, Rob. That's a point that is on my mind a lot, which is Milwaukee is a city that was proud of its differentiated European identity of whiteness not being a monolith. And in some ways, yeah, I agree with you, Rob, that it's almost surprising to see kind of whiteness become this rallying. I mean, not surprising, but Milwaukee might be the last place you'd expect that to happen because there were such distinct cultural groups within a pan-European identity.
One thing I've said over the years was that if you have a strong sense of us, you're going to have a strong sense of them.
Mm.
And in Milwaukee, there really were some very strong ethnic cultures. And I think Joe has studied this. The fact that we had a non-English speaking language group that was dominant here, the Germans. They were majority of the population. In some ways, that made Milwaukee safe for ethnicity of a European kind. The fact that you had in Boston, for instance, so the Yankee overlay is what drives things there. In Milwaukee, it was the Germans, so it was okay to speak Polish or Italian or Slovenian or whatever. But the thing that they could all agree on was that they were white.
Mm-hmm.
And when that became after World War II, especially between 50 and 70, when you have the Great Migration really kind of roaring into high gear in those post-war years, that's when it became something of a more linchpin of a cross-cultural identity. But in terms of some of the neighborhood dynamics, the North Side, one reason there was such entrenched resistance there was that you had these pretty intact German communities that lasted until well after World War II. So when you had African Americans moving just as the Germans had in that same northwesterly direction, you had oil and water. You had a real explosive kind of an encounter there.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna to add to that, and I think that to your point that I think one of the most remarkable things about ethnicity in the city is its continued prevalence, right? But that doesn't mean that it hasn't changed,
Sure.
right? And so whiteness, in Milwaukee as in elsewhere, to ascribe to whiteness and the visions and ideals of whiteness meant access to things like jobs and access to services, and it wasn't just agreeing on that. There were things that came along
Sure.
with shedding, maybe not shedding, but taking on this racial identity. And so I think that what we're seeing in a lot of those images, particularly how violently folks on the South Side were so willing to resist open housing, is kind of a protection of that quote unquote right that they felt like they had earned. And if we could maybe pull up a couple of those images, Adam, that I had added.
Get them
We
up
can
here.
see, 20 years, 20 years ago, we had the Second World War, but also really violent strikes at Alice Chalmers that had pitted, what we would think of white folks against white folks, right? Trying to gain access, trying to gain the rights and privileges and a better life in this community, and I think that the violent resistance to the open housing marches were, kind of in some way the logic, as flawed as it absolutely was kind of this vision of protection.
Mhm. My dear friend Reggie Jackson, I never thought I'd ever have to say this to you, but I know there's a lot going on in your head right now. Do you want to share a little bit of your reflections on this topic?
Yeah. That's great information that they've shared, Joe and John. One of the interesting things about Milwaukee in the early 1900s, it was the most foreign-born city in the country, and we had a larger percentage of foreign-born residents. So, there was kind of a normalcy in having people from different parts of Europe and living in their own, kind of segregated neighborhoods. One of the interesting things I discovered about kind of where Black people lived in the city is the area where the Menominee Valley is now. That used to be residential area. It was rezoned by city leaders in the 1920s as a way to create a barrier to prevent Black people from moving further south in the city. And so as Blacks were forced into an area where they couldn't move either south or east or even west, they ended up, living in a community that was really a quite mixed neighborhood. We consider the neighborhood that people refer to as Bronzeville as a Black neighborhood, but it was a mixed neighborhood. About half of the residents there were actually white people. And because of racial restrictive covenants and, the federal government's redlining policies, which restricted where Black people could move, they were kind of stuck in that the oldest housing stock in the city. And as John said earlier, as Black people kind of moved, they moved in the same direction that Germans moved. They moved north and west. So as Germans vacated neighborhoods, Blacks kind of moved in those neighborhoods. And so when we look at what happened with the open housing protest against it, it was really not just about open housing. It was really much more so about the fact that white people were not all that excited that the Black population had grown so rapidly. In 1940, there were only 7,500 Blacks in the city, nearly 9,000 in 1950, 21,000 in 1950, and over 62,000 by 1960, and over 100,000 by 1970. So this rapid growth in the Black population meant that Black people had to live in different neighborhoods because it was too overcrowded where they were living before. And as they encroached on those different neighborhoods, white people weren't happy. So one of the things that I tell people about the open housing marches, I think is left out of the conversation too much, is the open housing wasn't just about moving to the south side. It was actually about moving to the north side as well, neighborhoods they couldn't live in. Black people used to refer to the area north of Capitol Drive as Blackfish Bay. It was a very exclusive area that only a certain number of Blacks could live in. And so one of the sad things I think about the open housing campaign, we celebrate the successes of it, but I was able to look at a special census that was done in 1975. And it showed that in those neighborhoods on the south side, there were still barely any Black people. In most of those neighborhoods, Blacks were in single digits. So even though we celebrate the open housing marches as being successful in opening up the south side, it really didn't open up the south side. It opened up the north side and the northwest side, but the south side was still almost completely white. In fact, blacks didn't begin to move to the South Side in significant numbers until whites vacated some of those neighborhoods. Latinos moved in, and blacks began to move into Latino neighborhoods, but they never really moved in to neighborhoods with white people in great numbers on the South Side.
No, I think there's a geographic sort of a really underlying reality about Milwaukee, and that's the valley. And it may have been zoned industrial, but that goes back to the 1860s. You know, and that's a half mile wide. And I think what happened in Milwaukee, the only other example I can see in the Americas, the Cuyahoga Valley in Cleveland, you know, sort of east side and west side of Cleveland, that's strong too. But Menominee Valley is hugely important. And I think the role it played in Milwaukee, and this goes way back to the beginning, there was this really kind of a centrifugal force moving on. So people on the north side moved north, people on the south side moved south. And kind of never the twain shall meet. It didn't matter who was there. You know, there was very little crossing from north side to south side or vice versa. And I think what happened is, as you have first the German, then Eastern European Jewish, then African American, you know, the foothold there is north side and the vector is always northwest. On the south side, Walker's Point was diverse. South of Mitchell was, south of Greenfield was largely Polish. And the displacement's just amazing. So what you have in through the early decades of the 20th century, south side Polish, north side German. You know, that was the stereotype, and it was just as segregated, you know, as it is racially today. And this process of displacement now, south side Latino, north side African American. You know, so the cultures are different, but the geographic patterns are pretty close, you know, to what they were back in those early years.
You know, we've got a question from our attendees. By the way, guys, we have 53 folks listening in right now. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for your time to come in and share this with us. We got a question about the northwest side of the city. Can you all share any thoughts about some of the neighborhoods that would be northwest side? I know we've alluded to some regions generally, but I think that question wants to get us into more that western and northern region of the city. Any thoughts you can share about that?
The big name there is Granville, you know, which is the old township name. It goes everything from 27th to the county line, 124th Street, from Hampton up to the county line at Mequon. It's a huge area, you know, 36 square miles. And that was annexed largely in one big by the Zeiler administration after World War II, after a lot of fighting with brown deer. They wanted it too. And what that did basically was, with some annexations in the south side, it doubled Milwaukee's land area. You know, so that was really important to tax base and important culturally as well. One impact it had in terms of Milwaukee's culture is, again, that's the vector. You know, African Americans moving north and west, so they settled in the old town of Granville, and that has become, you know, places like what some of the Golden Gate, you know, some of the areas up the northwest side, and that's become, you know, sort of middle income African American in a lot of those sections. So housing that's suburban and everything but address, but part of Milwaukee, and that's been pretty much, you know, very much part of the settlement by African Americans as they continue to move. So it's an important part of Milwaukee.
Well, you know, that region does look and feel what would be traditionally Midwestern suburbia.
Absolutely.
And the layout of the homes, the streets, the sidewalks are not, you know, there are a number of indicators of what would be Midwestern suburbia in that region.
One point of information, do you guys know
about that?
Oh, go ahead.
That part of the city, as John said, you know, that was kind of an escape from the central city for African Americans who had, you know, decent incomes. But what began to happen though in the 1990s, when I moved back to Milwaukee, I began to see, I didn't even know I was away from Milwaukee for about 10 years when I was in the military. When I came back, I didn't even know that Black people lived out in that part of the city. But as I came back, I was invited to parties at, you know, people's homes and stuff out there. I began to notice that there are Black people out in that part of the city. And I had never explored that part when I was a kid. But one of the things that I started to notice in the early years I came back to Milwaukee, early 90s, is that there were more poor Black people moving out to that area. Particularly into the apartments that were out there. You know, that part of Milwaukee has the highest concentration of apartment buildings. And so you started to see poor Black people move out there. A lot of people with Section 8 housing vouchers moved out in that area. And so you began to kind of see that area transition and look a little bit different than it had looked before. It wasn't as exclusive as it had been before.
Yeah. North Meadows, is the big one out there, 91st Street. That was
Yeah.
a very, very far removed from the sort of subsidized housing in the heart of town.
Right.
But
One
much the
point-
same.
One point of information, the old Granville rail station on 107th and Brown Deer. Does anybody know what's in that building now? A Jamaican restaurant. It's Irie
Cool.
Palace. And I just looked it up. They're doing carry out and pickup. So yeah, I mean, speak of kind of progressions. Also, too, just one other thing about the northwest side of town. People are very enamored with the idea of Milwaukee being a small place. And I think it can be in some really beautiful ways. Like, I went to high school with John's son and stuff like that. But don't tell me Milwaukee's small until you know Granville. Because that is a huge swath of the city that the people who love Milwaukee as a small place would have a lot to learn. So, actually, speaking of which, I'm wearing a Rufus King hat right now.
Oh, very good. Very, very good, Adam.
I'm very provincial.
Command Central is telling us that we need to start to move to the second segment. Before we do, I want to give you folks any key thoughts, ideas about the immigrant migration experiences that you'd like to sort of wrap this section up with. Any thoughts you want to share with folks?
Let's do that in the next 3 hours.
Take your time, John. Take your time. Any thoughts at all, though, before we move?
If there's one takeaway, it's that Milwaukee's always been a city of newcomers, from the very beginning. It goes back to the early Yankees and them being uncomfortable with the Germans who kind of came in, and then the Poles coming and making the Germans uncomfortable. We've always been a city of diversity, which I think is one of our most important strengths and has also been one of our most difficult sticking points.
Yeah, I think another thing people don't realize, Milwaukee kind of started as a very segregated, space. Kilbourne Town, Juneau Town,
Right.
Walker's Point. So it started as a very segregated place, and we couldn't even build bridges across the rivers in town without causing people to fight over bridges and tear bridges down. So there's always been this consternation between the different groups in Milwaukee, and people are surprised at it, but that's part of how Milwaukee started.
Yeah, then it wasn't so much ethnic. It was I want money on my side.
Right.
Screw your side.
Yeah,
That's what
absolutely.
it amounted to.
Well, I think that also gets to the point of Milwaukee as being contested space, right? Starting from the beginning with white settler colonialism, and how did Milwaukee begin? Well, it began by evicting Native people from this land, and so that as being a key formation that then ends up continuing. Different groups coming in for jobs, for work. Those contests between labor and capital, and different groups coming in, old immigrants, new immigrants. These are very painful struggles that lie at the heart of what we think of as being a history of progress, right? The city from beginning to end, this line of growth, and how we imagine that is really important to how we think of the future, for sure.
I will give that man a PhD.
Ain't that America?